My relationship to nature, well, I'll approach it from talking about my childhood. So I grew up in Toronto, which was a very big city, became even bigger as I became an adult. And my only experience of nature was going to my grandmother's cottage for 1 week in the summer. And when I was there, I felt such freedom, such passion. That's the only thing I remember from any of my summers. So when I grew up, I followed a bad boyfriend out to Vancouver, and when I got there, I was like, I'm never going back, because where I live, there's mountains, there's water. You can go hiking in the mountains right from the city and be in nature. I think that I hesitate to use the word sacred, but if there's a feeling of holiness in my life, or if there's a feeling of something that I just acknowledge its existence with joy and wonder, it would be nature, even the darker sides of it. What also happened for me as a writer, my first book was involved studying human evolution, and I really think of us as we are animals. We're driven by evolution. Our behavior's driven by adaptation to situations that have changed, because with industrialization, everything's changed very quickly. But what interests me is the origins of that behavior, and then now, how could that behavior adapt in the future to reverse capitalism and reverse the rape and pillage of the planet?
Would you say there's differences in terms of gender in your line of work? And if there is, how do you navigate, how do you collaborate with that?
So in publishing of fiction, there's an organization whose name is escaping me at the moment, sadly, but they quantified how many of the big prizes, the reviews in the most prestigious newspapers, were about books by women versus books by men, were reviewed by men. And they found that there was a huge off kilter. So it was about 70% for men, 30% for women. And there's more women writers and more women readers, I think. So it's really off kilter. So it's one of those invisible feelings, like you know it's out there, and you don't know if it's affecting how people are receiving your work, the economic decisions about publishing and promotion. It's really tempting sometimes to just submit as a man and see what the difference in the experience is. I almost did that with my last book, because I wrote it in the voice of a male soldier in the year 2047 who had post-traumatic stress disorder. And I asked myself the question, would it be read differently if people thought it was written by a man? Same words, everything the same. And I'll never know, but I would like to know. I'd be really, really interested. That being said, women are in positions of power in publishing and editing and making decisions about that. But as some of the women at this conference have said, also in filmmaking, that often those women can be an obstacle. It's not always like a plus that they're there for authors. So the hardest thing now is it's invisible, really. It's there in the statistics, but as you experience it, and also being a creative writer, you never know if it's your work or if it's the social context. So it's difficult, but I definitely feel it. Yeah.
que tu as découvert ou appris tout à l'heure? Est-ce que tu as appris quelque chose tout à l'heure?
Okay. So I'm moderating a panel about writing, nature writing, through a female perspective. Was an interesting experience because it was uncomfortable, first of all, to think of the questions because once you talk about things from a female perspective, you're generalizing. And once you generalize, you're in deep trouble. So it was almost impossible to know how to enter that discussion. What became clear to me, because it was a variety of four academic women and one journalist and one fiction writer, so very different mindset. But what became clear was there's a discomfort in, I wouldn't say in identifying as a woman, but in connecting their work to being a woman. Everyone wanted the work to be pure in some way. And so I became aware that it's just even that as a woman is a territory with a lot of discussion, a lot of very different feelings, and very difficult. So yeah, my experiences, I realize I'm quite primal and I experience myself as a female animal. But then it was fascinating to have some of the women whose studies are language and deconstructing language and meaning and questioning, stepping back and saying, well, even you can't pose that question. If you pose that question, that means this. So it was fascinating to see the difference in how we talk about being women. It's massive. And really, I mean, I feel a little bit of impatience with having to have that discussion, how we talk about even being women, because we need to also be out in the world doing things and changing things and not even thinking about talking about that. But it was clear it's really important and it matters. And I guess one of the reasons it matters is over history, being a woman has been being put in a box, being contained, being defined, having way less freedoms and so on. So that's what matters. And it's a very uncomfortable area still to talk about. And so that was interesting. One of the other things that came out in the panel was how as humans, writing, talking, describing nature is grounded in our social context, so our social status and our circumstance in that group. And what is interesting certainly is that everything is affected, is modified from that reality. My experience of it is like a kind of blindness. You can't really see yourself. You don't know. So that's why you get editors. That's why you get readers to check your work to see what you're blind to, because we're all blind to so many things. But it can become quite a complex dance trying to understand. But I think it's important. I think it's actually very important for anyone expressing themselves in the cultural world to try with the best of their ability to see where their blindnesses are.
From your perspective, what do you think needs to change?
So I'm now 62, so I feel, because as I said in publishing, it's hard to put your finger on what's going on. There is definitely an imbalance, but there's nothing really to fight against. I have, from experience, seen that men Male readers tend not to read books by female authors in fiction. But nonfiction, I'm sure it's a whole different other thing. There's a few, obviously, and there's a change, but it is a generalization that holds. So where earlier in my life I might have tried to write in such a way that would bring in a male audience also, I've given that up. And so I'm actually only thinking about a female audience, and if men read, great. But so I've adapted myself to that.